The laughter hit like a slap, sharp, cold. It started with one voice, Professor Whitman's, and spread like wildfire through the classroom, burning through every corner of the polished lecture hall. "Son, this isn't the field you plow back home," the professor said, his tone dripping with smug amusement. The students laughed louder. Some tried to hide it behind their hands, others didn't bother. Malik sat in the center of it all, frozen, but not broken. The sound echoed around him, bouncing off the glossy whiteboards, the sleek wood, the scent of fresh coffee and privilege thick in the air. He sat still, his notebook open, his pen trembling but his gaze fixed. His hands weren't shaking from fear. They trembled with restraint. He'd known humiliation before, not from classrooms, but from the long fields of his small Alabama town, where his father's back bent under the weight of a day's sun and his mother's voice carried songs of endurance through the night. He knew what it meant to be tired, to be overlooked, to be told to stay in his place. But this was a new kind of weight, one made of laughter and polished words. Whitman didn't just mock Malik's answer about economic systems, he mocked Malik's right to even have one. It wasn't about what Malik said. It was about who was saying it, a boy with dark skin, a soft southern accent, and a thrift store shirt, trying to talk about theories written by men who never had to wonder where their next meal was coming from. "You see," Whitman continued, leaning back against his desk, "understanding macroeconomics requires more than just good intentions and country charm." The class roared again. Malik could feel the laughter brush against him like a storm wind, every snicker a reminder of the invisible walls he'd been warned about. He had thought hard work would be enough. He had believed that education was the bridge. But in that moment, sitting under Whitman's condescending gaze, he saw that sometimes bridges burned before you even stepped on them. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. His eyes stayed low for a moment, not out of submission but calculation. Then slowly he lifted his gaze. The laughter quieted, unsure. "I'll let my work speak, sir," Malik said softly. No defiance in his tone, just something steadier, firmer, the kind of calm that carries a storm behind it. The professor smirked again, but something in Malik's eyes made him pause just for a second before turning back to his lecture notes. The class moved on. Equations filled the board, voices murmured, pens scratched paper, but Malik didn't hear any of it. His mind replayed every laugh, every sneer. They didn't sting anymore, they lit a fire. Beneath his desk, in the worn leather of his bag, sat a sealed envelope, thick, official, with a crimson H embossed at the corner. His Harvard application. He hadn't told anyone, not his classmates, not even his father. Because he knew some dreams needed silence before they could breathe. After class, Malik walked the long hallway alone. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the marble floors, the same kind of echo that once followed his father's boots through muddy fields. He could almost hear his father's voice, quiet but firm. "They can take your pride, boy, but never your purpose." He held on to that as he pushed open the heavy door and stepped into the crisp evening air. The campus lights glowed gold against the twilight sky. Around him, students laughed and chatted, their confidence effortless. Malik walked slower, every step a silent promise. He would not let this be the end of his story. That night in the small dorm room he shared with two other students, Malik sat by the window. The wind outside carried the faint hum of the city, mixing with the sound of his roommate's distant music. He opened his notebook, the same one that had been on his desk earlier, and began to write, not just notes but ideas, equations, arguments, his own voice on paper. The laughter from class still echoed in his head, but now it sounded different, duller, weaker. Like an old memory that had lost its power. Hours passed, the clock hit midnight, his roommates had fallen asleep. Malik was still writing. He didn't stop when his hand cramped, didn't stop when his eyes blurred. The humiliation from that classroom had turned into fuel, raw, pure, unstoppable. When dawn finally painted the sky pale blue, Malik sat back and looked at what he'd written. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. And for the first time since the laughter, he smiled. Days turned into weeks. Whitman's class continued, each lecture another quiet test. Malik spoke less, but when he did, the words were sharp, deliberate. He spent nights buried in research, studying not just the theories Whitman praised, but the histories those theories ignored. The farmers, the workers, the forgotten hands that made economies move. He wasn't just learning economics anymore. He was learning power, how it was built, who it served, and how it could be challenged. One afternoon, as the semester neared its end, Whitman announced the final paper competition, a chance for students to present their own economic model to the faculty board. The prize, a scholarship recommendation. The class buzzed with excitement. Malik said nothing, but that night he pulled the Harvard envelope from his bag and placed it beside his laptop. A reminder, a challenge. He worked through nights again, the same rhythm as before, writing, revising, pushing himself until the sun bled through the blinds. He wasn't chasing Whitman's approval anymore. He was chasing truth, his own truth, rooted in the dirt, born of struggle and shaped by endurance. The day of presentations came. The lecture hall was full. Whitman sat in the front row, expression unreadable. Malik stepped to the podium, papers in hand. The room went still. His voice, calm and sure, began to fill the space, not with fancy words or polished jargon, but with clarity, with purpose. He spoke of markets through the eyes of the working man, of value beyond currency, of systems that forgot humanity. When he finished, silence followed, real silence, not the cruel kind from before, but the kind that comes when truth cuts through arrogance. Whitman stared at him for a long moment, no smirk, no laughter, just a slow, quiet nod. Later that evening, Malik walked alone again, the same path as before, but everything felt different. The laughter that once haunted him had faded into memory. The pain had turned into something else, strength. He stopped under a lamppost and pulled the envelope from his bag. It was time. He tore it open, unfolded the letter, and began to write. The same words that had once trembled on his lips now flowed with certainty. Dear Harvard admissions, I come from a place where the ground teaches you resilience before books ever do. The seed had been planted the day he was mocked. Now it was growing, and Malik, the farmer's son, was done shrinking. Laughter came again, just as cruel, just as sharp. It rolled through the lecture hall like thunder, familiar now, a rhythm Malik had come to expect. But what used to sting had become something else. A test, a reminder. Whitman's voice sliced through the noise, calm and cutting. You're bright for where you come from, he said, pen tapping against his grade book, eyes glinting with that same polished arrogance. The students laughed on cue, the same way they always did, some nervously, others without hesitation. Malik sat in silence, his eyes lowered to the page before him. His face gave nothing away, but inside, the words burned. Not because they hurt, but because they fueled something he couldn't yet name. Every test came back painted with red ink. Every essay returned with comments that felt like small jabs, unrealistic, overly emotional. Stay within the framework. Whitman's framework, of course, where truth fit neatly between footnotes and formulas, where pain was just data. Malik read every mark, studied every dismissal, and then quietly rewrote everything. He didn't need Whitman's approval. He was building something that didn't fit inside the man's limited sight. While the others celebrated after lectures, filling the campus with the sound of laughter and expensive perfume, Malik walked to the library. When they drank under string lights and shouted about internships, he was at his desk, his lamp glowing against the dark window, words spilling from his pen. His essays weren't polished the way Whitman liked, but they breathed. They spoke of things Whitman's textbooks forgot, the hands that picked, built, lifted. The men and women whose names weren't recorded, but whose labor held the world together. His writing carried the rhythm of his father's footsteps in the field. It carried the ache of long days and the quiet hope of mornings that began before dawn. He wrote about race, labor, and dignity, not as theories, but as lived truth. His words had soil in them, sweat, the faint smell of earth after rain. When he reread them, he could almost hear his father's voice. Son, don't fight to be seen. Let your work make them look. So he did. Whitman, of course, didn't notice. Or maybe he refused to. He still called on Malik in class with that same tone, half pity, half mockery. Mr. Davis, he'd say, perhaps you'd like to tell us what success means from your perspective. The smirk always followed. The class always laughed. Malik just nodded, jotting something down in his notebook. He stopped reacting weeks ago. Every insult, every chuckle, he turned them into kindling. Quietly, patiently. Then one afternoon, Whitman announced the final project. Redefine success, he said, writing it across the board in thick white chalk. In your own words, use theory, use data, use logic. His tone made it sound like a dare. Malik smiled, small but real. For once, the topic wasn't about numbers or graphs. It was about meaning, and that he understood better than anyone in the room. That night, Malik didn't eat dinner. He opened his notebook and began to write. And write, and write, not from textbooks but from memory, from moments that had shaped him. His mother's hands scrubbing dishes until the skin cracked. His father coming home from the fields with tired eyes but a proud spine. The nights when the lights went out and they'd sit together in quiet, the air thick with both struggle and faith. He wrote about how success wasn't measured by what you owned, but by what you overcame. About how knowledge meant nothing if it didn't serve someone beyond yourself. He wove in theory, yes, but he turned it into testimony. His words flowed like confession and prophecy at once. He didn't just write an essay. He built a story, a truth dressed as scholarship. By dawn, his desk was covered in papers. His eyes were red, his fingers cramped, but his heart felt light. When he finished the final line, he whispered the title to himself, The Soil Beneath Success. Then he smiled, folded the pages neatly, and placed them on Whitman's desk that morning before class began. Whitman barely glanced at it. "Ah," he said, flipping through the pages without reading. "Poetic." He smirked just enough for the class to see, but naive. The laughter followed, automatic, obedient. Malik didn't move, didn't defend, didn't break eye contact. He simply nodded once and said nothing. Then, under his breath, so quietly that only the boy sitting beside him could hear, he whispered, "We'll see." The class moved on, but something in the air shifted. Whitman's words no longer landed the same way. They slid off Malik like rain on stone. The laughter around him sounded smaller, weaker, less certain. He could feel it, something was changing, even if no one else saw it yet. That evening, when Malik walked across campus, the lights of the library glowed in the distance. He didn't stop there this time. He went past it, toward the old chapel that overlooked the courtyard. He sat on the steps and looked up at the stars. His breath came out in soft clouds. He thought about his father's words again, "Let your work make them look." He smiled. "They will," he murmured. Inside the classroom, Whitman would later flip through the essays, scanning the polished arguments of his favored students, quotes, data, predictable theories. Then he'd reach Malik's paper. He'd skim the first lines and pause. The tone was different, the language simple but heavy. As he read, something in his posture shifted. His smirk faded. The paper didn't sound like a student's assignment. It sounded like truth itself, grounded, relentless, human. But that moment hadn't come yet. Not for Malik, not tonight. For now he stood beneath the cold November sky, hands in his pockets, eyes full of quiet fire. The laughter from earlier was long gone, replaced by the steady thrum of his own heartbeat. He wasn't waiting for their approval anymore. He was building something bigger, a legacy stitched from pain, persistence, and purpose. And when Whitman's eyes finally fell on his words, when that polished man of theories saw what real success looked like, it wouldn't be Malik who was proven wrong. It would be the laughter. It happened on a gray morning, the kind of morning that carried silence like a warning. The campus was hushed, even the trees seemed to stand still. The semester was ending, the air thick with anxiety, papers returned and futures decided. Malik walked slowly through the hall, his backpack hanging low, his steps measured. The marble floors gleamed beneath his shoes, but his reflection no longer looked like the boy who once sat small in the middle of that lecture hall. Something in him had changed, not loud, not showy, just steady. He entered the classroom quietly. The chatter dimmed for a second, then returned, whispers curling through the air like smoke. Malik took his usual seat, back row, near the window. The sun hadn't broken through the clouds yet, and the room felt colder than usual. He set his notebook on the desk. the same one he'd filled with pages of late-night thoughts and stubborn hope. Whitman stood at the front, immaculate as ever, sharp suit, sharper words. His voice carried its usual blend of authority and arrogance as he passed out the final grades. His smile never reached his eyes. The room filled with the soft shuffle of papers, nervous laughter, the rustle of students checking marks. Then, as if the morning weren't already heavy enough, Whitman's voice cut through again. "Before we end," he said, looking directly at Malik, "let's hear from our philosopher farmer." His tone was light, but the cruelty behind it was deliberate. "Tell us, Mr. Davis," he continued, tapping his pen on the desk, "what does success mean to you now?" The room fell quiet. Every head turned toward Malik. Some smirked, others just waited. They'd seen this before, the professor's favorite show. Malik's heart beat slow, not from fear, but from something deeper. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, though he hadn't planned it. It had found him. He stood calm, no trembling this time, the same posture his father used to take when facing the hardest days, straight back, steady eyes. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a single envelope. It was crisp, official, sealed with crimson and gold. Without a word, he walked to the front and placed it gently on Whitman's desk. "Maybe this will explain it better than I can," he said softly. Whitman raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "A letter," he said, smirking at the class. "From who? Your local co-op?" A few students chuckled. Malik said nothing, just stood there, still and patient, the kind of quiet that carried power. Whitman broke the seal and unfolded the paper. The rustle of the letter sounded louder than anything else in the room. His eyes skimmed the first line, then they stopped. The smirk froze, half-formed. The room waited. He read again, slower this time. His lips parted slightly, his expression slipping from amusement to disbelief. The letter read, "We are pleased to inform you of your admission to Harvard University." For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The laughter that had been ready to burst from the students never came. It died before it began, strangled by the weight of that single sentence. Whitman's fingers trembled slightly as he lowered the paper. His face, usually composed and smug, had gone pale. The silence in the room was heavy, not just quiet, but full. The kind of silence that exposed everything, the arrogance, the cruelty, the smallness of it all. Malik stood there, not smiling, not gloating, just present, calm. His eyes met Whitman's, steady, clear. There was no revenge in his gaze, only truth. "Success," Malik said quietly, "means knowing where you came from and not letting it define where you're going." His words were soft, but they landed like thunder. Whitman didn't respond, couldn't. The man who'd built his authority on humiliation now found himself stripped of power by the very student he'd tried to diminish. Around them, the class sat frozen. The same faces that once laughed now looked at Malik differently, not as the boy from nowhere, but as something else. Proof. Malik reached for his notebook, the same one filled with ideas Whitman had dismissed. He slipped it into his bag. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. As he walked toward the door, the sound of his footsteps was the only thing that dared to exist in that silence. At the doorway, he paused, just long enough to look back. Whitman was still standing there, letter in hand, the Harvard crest gleaming faintly under the fluorescent light. Malik didn't need to say anything more. The truth was already echoing through every corner of that room. Then he left. The door closed behind him with a soft click. The echo lingered, not harsh, but final. Outside, the grey clouds had started to part. A thin line of sunlight broke through, painting the steps in gold. Malik walked down slowly, breathing in the cold air, each exhale lighter than the last. Inside, the classroom remained silent. No one spoke. No one laughed. The same walls that once shook with cruelty now held the quiet weight of revelation. Whitman stood alone at his desk, the letter still open before him. For the first time, he wasn't the one in control. And from that day on, that room, the one that had been filled with laughter at a young man's expense, never sounded the same again. The echo of Malik's dignity lingered there, soft but unshakable. Because sometimes victory doesn't come with applause. Sometimes it walks out quietly, leaving truth behind like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. And from that morning forward, the laughter that once filled that room would never return. Weeks later, long after the laughter had faded from those lecture halls, Professor Whitman sat alone in his office. The world outside his window was soft with winter light, pale, reflective, almost forgiving. The shelves around him stood heavy with degrees and plaques, each one a symbol of the world he thought he'd mastered. Yet for the first time in years, none of them seemed to mean much. On his desk lay a single paper, creased at the edges, the title scrawled neatly at the top, Redefine Success by Malik Davis. He had read it before, but now he read it again. Slower, every word pressed heavier than the last. The essays of his star students had faded into the background, sterile, precise, forgettable, but Malik's felt alive. There was heart in it. There was pain, truth, and something else Whitman couldn't name at first, humility wrapped in strength. His eyes stopped on one line, the one that had been haunting him since the day he'd first read it. Success isn't about where you stand. It's about how many times you rise from where they left you. He leaned back in his chair, staring at those words. The sound of them lingered like a sermon he couldn't shake. He thought about the day he mocked that boy in front of everyone. The laughter, the arrogance. He told himself it was harmless, a lesson in toughness. But now, sitting there, he saw it for what it was, cruelty disguised as intellect. He remembered Malik's calm eyes that day, not defiant, not angry, just steady. The eyes of someone who knew that time would tell the truth. Whitman took off his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. For a long time, he said nothing. Then quietly, to no one in particular, he whispered, "The boy I tried to teach was the one teaching me." He looked down again at Malik's essay, at the last paragraph, where the words seemed to rise off the page like prayer. We come from soil, and maybe that's why we grow. They can bury us in doubt, in shame, in laughter, but we rise anyway, because the ground remembers every seed that ever dared to push through. Whitman closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he felt something like humility. The farmer's son had soil on his hands, but stars in his reach. And Whitman, for all his learning, realized he'd never touched either. Graduation came with the golden glow of spring. The university lawn stretched wide, filled with proud families and shining cameras. Students lined up in black robes, their caps bobbing in excitement. Malik stood among them, tall, composed, his smile quiet but certain. When his name was called, Malik Davis, Bachelor of Economics, summa cum laude, the crowd erupted. Applause thundered across the courtyard. Some stood, some cheered his name. And among them, in the back row, stood Professor Whitman. He clapped slowly at first, then with both hands. His expression was unreadable, not shame, not guilt, just a kind of quiet pride. When Malik crossed the stage and their eyes met, there was no bitterness, no trace of the past. Just recognition, two men, once on opposite sides of a cruel lesson, now bound by something deeper, truth. Whitman nodded once, and Malik, in his robe and cap, nodded back. That was enough. No words needed. That night, the city lights gave way to open fields and quiet roads. Malik drove home, the sound of the tires humming against the old dirt path. The farm appeared just as he remembered, the wooden fence leaning slightly, the house breathing with age, the fields stretching into the horizon. His father stood on the porch, older now, slower, but still solid as the land he worked. Malik stepped out, diploma in hand. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved gently through the tall grass. Then his father smiled, the kind of smile that carried years of hard work and faith too stubborn to die. "You did it, son," he said, voice rough with pride. Malik shook his head softly. "We did it, Papa." He walked out into the field, where the earth was dark and rich under the moonlight. The same soil that once clung to his father's boots, the same soil that stained his childhood clothes. He knelt down, pressing his hands into it. The dirt was cool, familiar. It crumbled between his fingers, soft and steady, alive. He closed his eyes, breathing it in, the scent of beginnings and endings all at once. "We made it, Papa," he whispered, voice barely more than a breath. The stars above shimmered faintly, their reflection caught in his eyes. For a long moment, he stayed there, a son who had carried his roots farther than anyone had ever expected, returning home not to prove himself, but to give thanks. Behind him, his father stepped down from the porch, walking slowly across the field. He placed a hand on Malik's shoulder. No words passed between them. They didn't need them. The silence said everything. Somewhere far away, in a quiet office lined with degrees, Professor Whitman placed Malik's essay in a frame. He hung it on his wall, not as a reminder of failure, but of growth, of humility, of how even the proudest mind can still learn from the hands that touch the earth. And as the night deepened, Malik lifted his gaze to the horizon. The stars glowed like embers in the dark, and he smiled. He'd carried the soil with him in his hands, in his work, in his heart. And now, standing where it all began, he finally understood what his father had meant all along. Success wasn't the distance from the ground, it was how deeply your roots could still reach it.